back to the topic of consciousness and some elements of it. What I'm going to do tonight is follow up on some of the things we were talking about last time. I want to fill in a couple gaps and give an update or two, and then introduce a couple interesting elements of news items that I think will be of some general interest to us. Some of these having to do with issues of mental health that face all people at this time. You know, this has been a harsh couple of years with people on lockdown and experiencing financial stress, and so there are some interesting pieces of news that are popping lately in the arena of mental health, which certainly relates to consciousness, and I'll bring some of that stuff uh, in the course of things here. One of the first things, though, I wanted to get to is to cycle back to and offer a little bit of an update. You might remember, I think it was two of our discussions ago, when I mentioned the work of a woman named Suzanne Simard that was summarized here in one of these issues of my favorite science update magazine called The New Scientist. I show you a picture of Suzanne Simard because she's pictured here in this quite lovely article given by the magazine, and she is the one who risked a lot. She kind of swam against the stream and went out of her way to really be a pioneer investigating the complexity of forest ecosystems. And she's considered a real pioneer in this area. She's not the only one. And one of the things talked about in here was the fact that there's a degree of intercommunication taking place between the trees in a forest that far exceeds what people had known up to that point in time when she began doing her work some years ago now. And what I wanted to report as kind of a follow-up on that very interesting explication is that other people now picked up on the importance of this, and the work is being pursued by others. It's being extended. New wrinkles are being discovered. And I happened to run across a YouTube in the last day or two that was quite informative, and it jumped off from her work and talked about a few new developments in that area. And one of the things that's been learned now that is quite interesting to realize is that the medium, the modality that allows for the communication between trees, not just of one species of tree, in a forest, and it allows for chemical communication of state of alert, state of health, messages as to where nutrients are. It turns out trees are very much seeking sources of phosphorus and nitrogen. All plants are, as they explore the environment around them. Those are two of the limiting nutrients that plants need in order to do their thing and be healthy. So plants, they fix carbon out of the air, right? But they're looking for nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil, among other things. Well, there's a complicated web of signals that alert plants as to where the phosphorus and nitrogen are, and then also a way of delivering and helping for them to absorb it by endocytosis, I believe the word is. I probably have that wrong. Turns out it's the Mycelium Mat. It's the fungi. And this is a very interesting topic of study, the extent to which the entire terrestrial world above ground, underground, but above ocean, on the land masses, is interconnected by these microscopic, mostly, or rarely visually discernible mats of fungal mycelium that interconnect trees and species. So, for example, one experiment that has been described is that if you inject radioactively labeled chemicals like differentiable isotopes of nitrogen or phosphorus or even carbon for that matter in one part of a forest into a certain tree. These are not radioactive necessarily, and they're not dangerous. I'm not talking about putting uranium waste into forests. This is much more subtle than that. These are isotopically labeled chemicals where we use a technique called mass spectroscopy in order to trace where they go. You can dose birch trees in a forest with isotopically labeled carbon, for example, and find it within a matter of hours showing up in nearby conifers, pine trees. And wow, what's up with that? How and why are these trees communicating chemically? Well, it turns out that it's because of the interconnecting mycelium mat. And our forests and the plant life on our planet upon which we depend and keeps us all going is intimately tied up with the health and activities of our friends, the fungi. And people tend to think of fungi as mushrooms, okay, in shorthand. People tend to think of mushrooms as being very much like plants. Well, actually, they're more like us. The biological tree of relationships, the way it works, is that we're much more closely related to fungi as animals than either of us are to plants. Plants branched off of the tree of evolution, which led to fungi and then mammals a long time ago. So the plants are much more different from us genetically than we are from our fungal brothers. And it turns out, if it wasn't for those fungal brothers in these little microscopic mycelium mats in the ground helping the trees fix and find and obtain their crucial source nutrients of nitrogen, phosphorus, and other things, this whole thing wouldn't work, and we probably wouldn't be here. So that's a very interesting element of this that has come out relatively recently. Another point of interest and follow-up on her work about the magic of the forests is it turns out that there are now identified many plants. I don't know specific to trees, but many plants who amongst or besides chemical cues for communicating with each other, they actually put out pulses. There's a very it's a low frequency sound pulses, not very loud, although you can pick them up and record them. They're acoustic. They can be picked up on a stethoscope. Plants will put out a steady beat of a low amplitude, low frequency pulsing sound to each other as part of their communication network. Now, nobody really knows yet what the sensing organisms are. Where do you find the ears on a plant? How is this working? This is all under investigation. This is really quite a new discovery, and I was very charmed by it when I heard this. I don't know that this has yet been isolated and found to be of importance in trees. I suspect probably so. I mean, it stands to reason. So I think there's probably botanists and ecologists scouring the forests all over the place as we speak here with stethoscopes and high sensitivity recording equipment looking for these pulses of sound, and then we'll be trying to figure out the context. When and why are plants pulsing sound waves at each other in that soil environment that unifies and feeds them all? That's quite a thing. That's quite exciting. I love it to learn about something sort of new and amazing like that. There was another aspect of that study had to do with responsive plants. So there are plants, some of which, if you touch them, they'll recoil. So they'll like close up their leaves. You're probably familiar with the Venus flytrap type plants and those ones that'll respond in a way to entrap an insect. There's also a whole family of plants that will just roll up their leaves on a time scale that we can see. So it happens to coincide with the human perception time scale, so we see them as reactive plants. Well, here's an amazing thing. The woman talking in this particular YouTube that I watched, she did a brilliant experiment, as biologists are trained to do. And she looked for a hallmark of intelligence in animals, which is called habituation. In other words, if you can do this to microbes, you can do this to rodents, you can do it to lizards, you can do it to people. If you've got a stimulus, like just say a clap, and you clap and it makes your cat have a startle reflex, well, if you do that regularly enough, often enough, and it's not followed by any kind of problem or any kind of danger or anything that would put up a big defense alert, your cat will eventually stop responding to that. So will a lizard, so will a chicken, so will a mouse, so will a rat, so will insects. Turns out, so will plants. You can habituate plants from their fairly short time scale response to a stimulus. The way the particular scientist in the study that I was listening to studied this was to take these plants in a pot and just drop them a few feet onto a soft landing. So that you take that plant, you drop it along a rail so it doesn't go out of kilter and harm the plant, but the plant would fall for about a foot and hit softly, but enough to get a thunk out of it, and then the leaves on the plant would all close up. The plant's scared, there's something going on, what's up? And then nothing. No harm, no further threat, no further problem to the plant. Well, closing up those leaves costs energy, both in terms of moving the plant tissue, they have to spend energy to do that, and by closing up and furling up their leaves, they're not getting fed sunlight anymore. So it costs the plant in two ways in order to respond to this perturbation of being dropped. And so interestingly, they would habituate after a few times of being dropped, startled, with no consequence. They'd figure out, oh, I don't have to worry about getting dropped a foot and a half onto a soft landing that's been engineered by some kindly scientist, and they would stop responding to that precipitating event. And then she proceeded to do tests to discover, well, once you habituate a plant to the stimulus of being dropped, how long do they remember it? And I'm reaching now. It was at least for periods of days that the plant would remember not to be startled by that dropping event. It might even have been longer, and that's impressive. I mean, I have two cats. One of them won't remember habituation to this for more than a few hours. So those plants have something going on. They habituate, they have a memory, they retain that biological trait of habituation to stimulus for a very significant period of time. Wow, how interesting is that in terms of this question of what is consciousness and how do we define it? How far does it extend? What are its embodiments and what's its function? Well, that's pretty cool. You might, all of you who are old enough, remember a book and a movie called The Secret Life of Plants that was published some years ago. I happen to be friends with a guy who was featured in that book and movie at certain points along the way, a certain old lovable science friend of mine named Marcel Vogel, who was, oddly enough, a graduate of the same university where I taught for 35 years, although he was there many years before I arrived as a young assistant professor. And Marcel and I had some interesting discussions along the way about plants, his work on plants, although when I got to know him, he had actually transited onto and become more interested in science having to do with crystals, and that was a fun area of discussion. So, all right, that's it on our friends the trees, or the ints as we might call them. they continue to deliver surprises, and I'll probably be coming back to you with more updates along the way as we go on. Another little update that is relating to things that I've spoken to you about before has to do with something called the mirror test. So cognitive scientists who study animals and who are interested in the measurement of and signs of cognitive sophistication and cognitive processing in animals, one of the tests that they use is something called the mirror test. So this is in the March 27th edition of my favorite magazine here. They report on the fact that we have now shown that horses pass the mirror test. There's no real pictures here for me to show you, so I won't go into that. But what they did was they put it turns out they had to use a colored marker. You couldn't just put a white dot on their forehead the way you can with some animals, but they had to put a strangely colored patch on the forehead of horses in order to get them to elicit the behavior wherein they exhibit what we would call metacognition, in other words, self-awareness, and realize that that horse they're seeing in the mirror is them, and it's not some other horse. Now, you can show a mirror or a computer screen webcam type self-imaging to lots of animals and get them to stop and look. Like cats, for example, will find it interesting, and they'll cock their head sideways, this and that. They'll go around and they'll look in back of the screen or the mirror and say, where is there a cat? But wait, there's no cat back here. And dogs, the same thing. And yet, cats and dogs don't pass the mirror test in the sense of realizing that that's them in the mirror or in the laptop screen. They know it's something and they take it seriously, but they don't have the metacognition to get the self-assessment. So up till now, animals who have passed the mirror test, the way it works is that the animal will stare extra long if they see a white dot on their forehead, for example, or they will actively try to remove that dot from their forehead, or they'll act a little freaked out about a dot that's placed on their forehead. So this is a way of distinguishing them from just any old animal who could be somebody else that they see in the mirror or in the computer screen. So animals that pass the mirror test at this point are most of the primates, like chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans, I'm pretty sure. Dolphins pass it with flying colors. Other cetaceans, I believe, have passed it. Magpies and some of the corvid bird group have passed it. There are some other ones I'm forgetting, but anyway, we can now add horses to the list, which is just fascinating. And you know, horses act pretty intelligent. You get the sense when you look into the eyes of a horse, you get the sense there's somebody looking back. And so this is not real surprising to me. I guess what's surprising that it took until now in order to discover this ability of metacognition, a sense of self. And so the horses, upon seeing a strangely colored thing on their forehead, not something they could feel, they had to see it in a mirror, would actually spend a while trying to rub it off, or with their leg, or on a post or something. So I found that really quite interesting. So there are many cognitive scientists who say that this is not a fair test of metacognition, and that they can find other forms of metacognition that aren't the same as the mirror test. It's somewhat anthropocentric, the way in which we design and apply the mirror test to animals. And so there are many cognitive scientists who will argue that it is too strict of a test of metacognition, and we need to lighten up on who we're going to grant metacognition and not hold them to quite such a stringent test as that. But yeah, we'll see where this goes in time. I found that really quite fun. and interesting. Then another one I wanted to get to in terms of a bit of sort of news we could maybe use someday, or this is the one, or one of the two relating to elements of mental health and guarding of mental health, is that there is recently, quite recently, a large breakthrough in terms of how to treat what is referred to as refractory depression using deep brain implant electrode technology. So see, this is in the an October issue of this year, and the specific article is this one, which describes a treatment that's been developed for people who are suffering, in many cases, lifelong and completely drug refractory depression, being alleviated from that using the next level of deep brain electrode implantation. And this is a very important advance. This has been around for a while. We've known that there were certain brain regions where you could sink long, thin wires. So these are minimally invasive. There does still have to be penetration of the skull, but long, thin wires, and then run very modest amount of electrical current between them, and free people up from crippling, devastating, disabling depression that doesn't go away with any other kind of treatment. That's been around for, I think, over 10 years now. But what's been recently realized in this particular report is the next level, much more intelligent application of that treatment modality, which is to place a small number, not a huge bundle of, but multiple very fine electrodes into the amygdala region, or excuse me, not the amygdala, into a region of the brain which is called the ventral capsule and ventral striatum part of the brain. That's where the stimulus is delivered. And then another smaller bundle of electrodes is placed in the amygdala. Now, some of you who may have at some point studied anything having to do with brain physiology and neuroscience, you might realize that the amygdala that's one of the organs or brain regions involved in a system in the brain called the limbic system. The limbic system is sometimes called the fight or flight network, and it's a brain region. It's got bilateral symmetry. You have an amygdala on the left and amygdala on the right, and if your limbic system is overactive, and this is a very frequent consequence of childhood trauma or other kinds of trauma or really bad PTSD, and then there's other just idiopathic, we don't know where it came from, sources of hyperactive limbic system that just make people crazy, put them at a high risk for suicide, high risk for disability from levels of depression that they just can't deal with and can't work through. And drugs just bounce off, because that drug treatment of depressive symptoms is very hit or miss. It can be liberating and wonderful for some people, but not for all. Well, what happens here is that we've now learned, the science has advanced to the point where we know that if there is what we call a high degree of gamma synchrony, that means pervasive over a region of space, 40 hertz, approximately 40 hertz, 40 beats a second type of brainwave synchrony in the amygdala. That's one of the key structures in this fight or flight anxiety brain circuit. Turns out, if you deliver a small number of pulses for a relatively short duration of time to this ventral capsule and ventral striatum, it's abbreviated as the VCVS system of the brain. you can actually turn off that depressive episode. And so, for example, there are patients here who report what this is about. What's this like? There's one woman who had been pretty much disabled by depression for her whole life, and she was one of the early patients in the study of this new modality. And one of the quotes here is, she says, "When I first received the stimulation, I felt the most intensely joyous sensation." And then it goes on. She describes how liberating that was, and how she was then able to take up hobbies that she used to have years ago and find interest and joy in life, and not just be sitting around crying all the time and feeling too heavy to move, which is one of the classic symptoms of a refractory depressive state. So, hallelujah. Now, this is early days in this research. They're still doing the clinical trials. This hasn't been released broadly yet, but it will, and it's going to be wonderful. And what's part of what's so great about this is that it rides on the back of ever-increasing sophistication in brain science. In this case, realizing, oh, there's this part of the brain over here that goes into periods of hyperactivity in a certain frequency band of brain waves, the gamma region. Now, paradoxically, interestingly, Tibetan monks who are trained for years and years and years to do loving kindness and compassion practice, they figure out how to attain gamma synchrony in parts of their frontal and temporal lobes. That leads to enlightenment and all kinds of very much sought after and beautiful transcendent mental states. But 40 hertz gamma synchrony in your amygdala, bad. Well, you can pick that up with a few electrodes that are inserted and probe it. Then there's a small little CPU. I don't know if it's subcutaneous or if it's wireless. Or the physical network, they didn't describe it here. But that sends a message then to a control unit which applies some pulses of current to the VCVS network and another couple of small little brain regions, and shuts that off. And what's great about that is it's not continuous stimulation. That means that the wires that you put there aren't going to begin to build up any kind of scar tissue or overload the nearby neurons that are receiving the current. And we're dealing now with a far more intelligent form of deep brain stimulation than what was the case when this was discovered 10 or 12 years ago in the first deep brain stimulation type experiments. That's just wonderful. And as a scientist who's following this area, my hat's off. I mean, the people who figured this out, that is some smart science there. Understanding the brain pathways that are going to see an effect over there, realize, oh, we can intervene with a new cause over here with some pulses of current and change that condition. So we now put in a cause and we see the effect, which is breaking up of that gamma synchrony that was holding the person in a canatonic level of depressive state. That's a big deal. One other aspect like this that I think I'll choose not to talk about here tonight and put off till next time has to do, this is from another magazine that, this is highly accessible magazine. Anybody can read and enjoy this magazine. You don't have to be a scientist in order to get into it and appreciate it. In the particular episode, or issue that I'm looking at here, it is from November of 2020, so this is a year ago, and it's getting into topic of bacteria in the brain, and this dovetails with findings that are increasingly important and published about having to do with the gut and the brain. It turns out that the health, the nature of and the health of the gut bacteria that you're carrying around with you has massive influence on what's going on in your brain. Most of the serotonin in your body is synthesized by your gut bacteria. There are also bacteria which can invade the brain. They can cross both the gut to blood barrier and the brain blood barrier. And what we're discovering is that there is more going on in terms of infectious agents causing various types of mental health disorders, and including some disabling ones, than we had ever appreciated. And so one way to treat mental difficulties is to give these sledgehammer drugs that rearrange your receptors of your neurons and change the balance of your neurotransmitters and do all kinds of heavy duty stuff in your brain, and it doesn't work for everybody. What we're realizing now is that if you cure somebody's IBS or find a way to repopulate their gut microbes, mental health issues will spontaneously resolve in a period of a month or two. And that's a whole new wave of massive public health implications that's being mapped out. And I'll devote a whole talk to that sometime in the next round or two of what we're doing here. I'm quite excited by that one. I think it's really of paramount importance, and it's very topical, just because along with this couple years of social and economic dislocation because of the pandemic and the lockdowns and all the turmoil about, who's going to get vaccinated, who can't for reasons of their own physiology, who won't for reasons of psychology and misinformation, all of that complicated stuff. There's a lot of people struggling. Suicide rates are at an all-time high. Drug addiction rates are at all-time highs. We are a stressed population. And so anything that can come up and help us in terms of managing those kinds of problems in our society is very welcome, and it's going to make the difference in lots and lots of lives. I'm getting close to the end. I think I've been talking here for about a half an hour, and I'm told that's a good place to bring it in for a landing. So I think maybe I'm going to close it right there. I'll give you a little bit of a preview of where we're going to go next time. You've heard me speak a lot now about neurons and the mechanism of what they do, what is an action potential, what it's composed of. We know that it's an electrochemical disturbance that travels down the axon of a nerve cell, gets to the end, and it releases neurotransmitters that diffuse across a gap. It's called a synaptic cleft, and then changes the state of excitation of the next neuron down the chain. One of the things you've heard me talk about is the fact we now know that these electrochemical perturbations are also accompanied by a perhaps equally as important pressure wave. There's a compressional wave, sometimes called a phonon. A phonon is fancy quantum mechanical language for a sound wave, essentially, in a material. So there are compression waves that are accompanying these electrochemical potentials, and in some cases with exact one-to-one overlap with the action potential, other cases not. I think harmonic relationships in some instances. But is consciousness depend on neurons, really? Do you have to have neurons for there to be what we might call conscious awareness? That moment of it, that fundamental unit of perception and apperception, that there's something going on? Well, maybe not. So, preview. This is a picture of a one-celled organism that has no nervous system, and yet it exhibits fairly complex behaviors. It's a predator, walks around, has a way to move towards things it wants to eat, catch them, and eat them, and no nervous system at all. And so I've been trying to study a little bit up on situations where it sure seems like there's consciousness happening. It may be small. It's not us. It's not philosophy and argumentation, but it's something. And next time we'll talk about what that is and what some of the minimum components for that might be, because it's an interesting question and it goes real deep. It goes deeper than just single-celled organisms with internal structures that seem to be able to act like little computers, somehow enabling decisions. It goes to the level of molecules and things that we refer to as dissipative structures. And that's where I'll be trying to steer our discussion in the next time or two. It'll be coming up. So with that said, I'd like to repeat well wishes for our friend J.R. Collier and say good night to you. And I hope you're all doing well. And my blessings to you. I hope you have a great week ahead. And good night.